Most of us living in Northern Ireland, particularly those over 40 or so, know the name Kincora. But I didn't realise until I read this book how much about that story I did not know. And what I found out whilst reading the book shocked me to the core. The book's been launched, it's available now from the usual outlets, and I'm delighted to welcome Chris Moore to the NTV studios to talk a little bit about the book. And I stress the word little advisedly because we're not going to have time, you'll be glad to know, to talk about the whole book in the half hour that we've got. Chris, you're so welcome to NVTV.
Thank you.
The story of how this book came to be written is your story in a way that's very seldom seen in journalism. It's been a hard and a heavy road for you over the past 45 years. And what I want to do now is to go back to the start of the story and have you explain how you first got involved. As a previously experienced journalist, but just started at the BBC, how did you get that story? It was a big story when it broke. How did that happen?
Well, it wasn't actually the big story, it was a disgusting story. And the newspaper that broke the story on the 24th of January 1980, they did not identify Kincora by name. So the story talked about a boys' home in East Belfast where the boys had been subjected to sexual abuse by people in the home, the staff who were supposedly looking after these boys, who largely came from broken homes and who were really disadvantaged and had no one in their corner to fight their battles for them. That's where it started. I quickly became familiar with the name in the same way as Sir John Herman, the police chief constable, would have become familiar with the name, because it didn't take long making phone calls to some social workers that I played rugby with, for example, to find out that it was Kincora. And from that point on, because I'd got some knowledge from social workers, the BBC allowed me to sort of attach myself to the story.
How did it feel as you started to explore that story? How did it feel as things became evident to you that maybe weren't in the public domain at that stage?
Well, the first thing that struck me was the depravity of it all. And I was very quickly able to reach out to people who had been resident in Kincora, and they were able to tell me some of the stories of the depraved behaviour of the 3 staff in Kincora. 2 of them had been there from the start in 1958. One of them, the third, the most interesting character, was William McGrath. And when I began to dig down into his background, that's when it started to really take off, because he was a leading figure in the Orange Order. He had his own Orange Lodge, which had a Gaelic inscription on its banner. He was an evangelical Christian, passionate about being anti-Catholic. He didn't want Catholicism anywhere near Northern Ireland, and he wanted a united Ireland, but under a Union flag. And that was the man who was the most violent of all the people who were abusing children in Kincora.
But the other 2 guys who'd been there a lot longer than McGrath, how qualified were they for the job?
This was at a time when it wasn't always what you knew, but who you knew. And they got jobs. And Mains, the man who was appointed as the warden of Kincora, he had no qualifications that matched that job description, but he had a history of looking after young boys, and that helped him get the job. Semple worked in the shipyard. He had no qualifications whatsoever, but he did know Joe Mains, and Joe Mains helped him get a job, told him about the job, and that's how he got there.
The thing that beggars belief is that youngsters from Kincora had been going to the police from the early 60s saying, we are being sexually abused. Why did it take so long for this to come to light?
Well, the police who were challenged to go to Kincora were easily fobbed off by Joe Mains. Joe Mains was able to say, for example, oh, listen, we have to check their underwear, that they're staying clean. So that's what was happening. There wasn't any skullduggery, there wasn't any intimacy involved. It was simply that. And we make enemies when we do that sort of thing, where the boys then don't like us and then they will tell tales. And that's how Joe was able to talk the police around and say, and actually Joe had a brother who was a police inspector and he didn't advance the case against Joe at all.
I'm going to move on a little bit now and talk about after the story broke in the paper, the Chief Constable, Sir John Herman, contacted a very senior detective, George Caskey, and asked him to head up an investigation, actually on the same day as the story was published. As that investigation progressed, how did your journalistic investigation journey go?
I started the same way as George Caskey did. I was looking for former residents. But I knew George Caskey well from going to terrorist incidents where the white tape was up. And George Caskey was very different from lots of other policemen. He would have engaged with reporters. Now, my friendship with George grew with the Kincora investigation because George knew what I was doing. He knew because I was doing reports on television. After the court case in which the 3 Kincora staff were among 6 men who were convicted and jailed, George contacted me, and it was February 1982. And George asked me to meet him. It was around midnight in a public car park at a shopping centre in Carryduff. And I met him, and George said, your stories are causing problems. Not on this side, but on the other side. You're ruffling feathers in Westminster. And your problems are with MI5.
So 1982, early 1982 was when you first became aware that there was an interest by the security services in the Kincora story. I'm going to move back just a fraction here though and come to one thing that puzzles me, which is McGrath, who we've mentioned a couple of times now and will mention again, had held on to his claim he was innocent. He'd never done any of these things. But when the case came to court on the first day, McGrath changed his plea from not guilty to guilty. Why?
That is the $60,000 question, because what happened, I was in the court that morning and I, like all the others, had learned enough about McGrath to know that if he was pleading not guilty, we were going to get some idea about the story of this orange man who was involved in some way in Kincora and with MI5. And we were waiting for that because we thought that'll clear the air. That'll bring out the truth of Kincora and why MI5 would have any interest in Kincora. The interest, of course, was not directly in Kincora. It was in McGrath, Tara, and all the unionist politicians that he knew and the paramilitaries that he knew. That's where they were interested. And McGrath's barrister was Desmond Bull. And Desmond Bull that morning asked if he could see his client and in private, and he went away. And when he came back, he astounded us all by saying that his client wanted to be rearraigned and would admit to a number of charges. And that's what happened. McGrath pled guilty to a number of charges. And therefore, the ventilation of the facts died away with him because there weren't any facts. Everybody was pleading guilty.
So the 30-odd witnesses called to that case weren't given their day in court?
No, they were sitting in in a room somewhere near the court where this was taking place, but they never got their say. Those who did get their say were those who decided to speak quietly and anonymously to reporters like me.
And we'll come back to that shortly. But Chris, how did you feel about the verdict?
Well, the verdict should have put Kincora to bed. 6 men, all found guilty of serious sex offences against children. But in my opinion, they got off lightly. And I mean, that raised a hair with me. My motive for engaging in the Kincora story was now because of the disgraceful way in which children were ignored. Children who told social workers, whose parents told social workers, who had the police involved for all those years, 2 decades, and not one case was ever brought before the court. And George Caskey, who headed up the first investigation, he discovered that, yes, the police had been negligent, and he said so in his report. But there was one other thing that troubled George Caskey, and that was this. He told me that the people in Westminster, MI5, were blocking his investigation. They were obstructing his investigation, he said. And I wasn't allowed to do anything with that. I had to sit on that to keep right with George. Eventually, George decided the time had come. He'd tried as hard as he could to persuade the Director of Public Prosecutions in Northern Ireland to get the Chief Constable on his side, to say it's time we prosecuted MI5 for obstructing my investigation.
And George privately said to you to look more closely at MI5?
Yes, he said keep digging because there are more facts to be revealed about MI5. And at one stage, right, this is quite remarkable, but at one stage, George put me on the floor on the back of his car. He threw a blanket over me and he smuggled me into Castlereagh. We went round the back of the Castlereagh building and there were sort of like, there were mirror images of the entrances at the front, at the back. And he brought me in and we went to an office. I assumed it was his office. And there was a coffee table and there were 3 or 4 files on it. And he said, you can look at these. These are Kincora files. But don't touch them. I'll turn every page, he said, as he had a sip of whiskey while I read. And in those days, there was no mobile phones. All I had were my eyes and a notebook.
And your memory.
And my memory, which was invaluable in these cases.
Absolutely. One of the things that puzzled me about the outcome of the case was that, in spite of the fact that the staff from Kincora, from Williamson House and from Bonmore were exchanging information about these young people, almost trading them with each other, the police investigation team didn't claim there was anything close to resembling a paedophile ring. Why was that?
Well, I can understand perhaps something about why they chose to adopt that stance, and that was because boys, not all the boys were telling the truth about what happened to them, okay? That's the simple fact of it. And some of them were very afraid to speak up because they had been speaking up for 2 decades and nothing was done. So they weren't being encouraged by the authorities to speak up, to tell the truth, because nobody seemed to believe them. And so that's one thing. And the other thing that was troubling from George Caskey's point of view was that he recognised that there were feelings, but he also recognised that there were instances of investigative opportunities that were lost. And they were lost because people in authorities, in the police and in the Secret Service, MI5, they decided to stop them in their tracks.
That must have made the whole process so hard for you.
Well, I was very lucky with some of my social work contacts, and I was introduced to a policeman who in 1975 was investigating the case of one teenage boy who had complained to his social worker, and the social worker put me in touch with the policeman, that he had been interfered with sexually by an uncle, a relative. And that took me eventually to the boy's father in Watford. I spoke to the father and I asked him about this investigation, and he said, I went across to Belfast when I learned about this. And the police showed me some photographs of my son, perfectly innocent as far as I was concerned, but there was one photograph which showed my son performing sexual favours on an adult with other children in the background. I never got that photograph. But the police officer who was telling me this said, this boy may not ever have been in Kincora as a resident, but for some reason he told me my investigation led me to Kincora. He began surveillance. He watched, took photographs, car registration numbers, people coming and going at strange times. Two of the people that he noted going in were from the Northern Ireland office. Both of them were MI5. And I know one of them, the two names that he got, was someone in MI5 who was fined £100 in a London court for soliciting sexual favours in a public toilet at a railway station in London. So that all was very encouraging for a journalist, because here we had a situation where MI5 were involved, where there was secret blockages of investigative operations by both the police and by someone in army intelligence. And the policeman was told, prosecute the uncle and leave the rest behind. Forget about it.
And how many times did that happen in your investigations, where you came across someone who had been following a line and they were told to redact, to change, to drop and move on?
There were two instances that are sticking out in this investigation that I did. In 1975, MI5, the leader of MI5, called Ian Cameron, he's now deceased, told an army intelligence officer called Brian Gemmell, we interviewed him on camera, and Gemmell thought that he had good information about McGrath. But MI5 told him to leave the whole thing alone. We're not interested in homosexual activity in the case of McGrath. And at the same time, this police officer that I knew was asking for more officers to extend the investigation, because he was convinced that there was something untoward happening in Kincora. Of course, he did what he was told, as did the army officer. They forgot about Kincora, and the police prosecuted the one man, the boy's uncle. And I tracked him down, and I asked him for an interview, and he told me to bugger off, basically. Mm-hmm. So the policeman who had conducted all this promised me that what he had in his locker were the photographs, the identifications from the car registrations. There were two justices of the peace, and there were two police constables who were going in and out of Kincora. And he said, there'll come a time when I'll share this with you, because no one in the police seems to be interested in this. And then he disappeared, wouldn't take my telephone calls. And it was then that I discovered that someone in the BBC who would have been above me in authority had given his name to an assistant chief constable who was looking after intelligence at the time. when I eventually persuaded him to meet me and he told me that, I was gutted, because I believed that I'd done the right thing. In my first ever investigation, I'd given my bosses the name of my police source so that they would know I wasn't making this up. There was a real person behind this. It made me think twice about doing that ever again.
That wasn't the only time you got led down by people, colleagues, by organisations that you were working with. How did that make you feel? How did you manage to keep going in spite of all these setbacks?
The thing that motivated me was the dreadful testimonies I listened to from the boys. And no matter how I'd done this with that commitment to them, because they were denied justice. They were denied a life, because no one, and I don't believe society to this day fully understands the ramifications of a paedophile interfering with a child.
Talking of the victims, one of those spoke to you directly in 2023. That was Arthur Smith in Australia. And he described some awful things that happened to him. Now, I don't want you to go into details that we're not comfortable with, that you're not comfortable with, but who did Arthur Smith have his second sexual encounter that he mentioned to you? Who was that with?
Well, Arthur Smith, his parents were getting divorced. The judge in the divorce case sent him by taxi that very day to Kincora, because that was the only place that they could find to put him. And when he saw Kincora, he thought he'd landed in heaven. But soon he was raped twice by McGrath. And then McGrath brought him downstairs to meet his friend Dickie. And Dickie raped him twice in a week inside Kincora. And it was only after he had left Kincora by a couple of years, 1979, he said he saw the man who'd raped him on television. It was Lord Mountbatten. And Mountbatten had, on that day, the 27th of August, 1979, Mountbatten had been killed in an IRA bomb explosion near Sligo, where he had a holiday home. In the years that I was investigating Kincora, there were 5 people that I'm aware of who claimed Mountbatten interfered with them sexually. When Arthur Smith described what happened to him, he said it was 1977. He was 11 years of age. And I was able to check up, thanks to the work Andrew Lowney did, through Southampton University, the diaries that had been published, and showed that Mountbatten was in Ireland in August for the most of, nearly all of August of that year.
Why did it take so long for the idea of the Secret Service's cover-up to come out? And do we still know the full extent of it? No,
we don't, because the Secret Service that's mostly in the heart of this is MI5. And MI5 have refused to cooperate with the Kincora criminal investigation. They, behind the scenes, and I've now got the documents that show this, they campaigned to end the plan by the Tory government in 1982 to have a judicial inquiry that would have the powers of the High Court to compel witnesses and documents. They stopped that inquiry, and instead we got an inquiry. It was called the Hughes Inquiry. They got it also with a retired English judge, William Hughes, and William Hughes did not investigate the police or MI5. He concentrated only on his terms of reference, which were to look at social services.
And that's not the extent of the cover-up, because we have documents pertaining to Kincora that are under embargo until...
Well, this is the surprising thing. When they announced the latest inquiry, because there have been 7 inquiries, 4 public, so-called public inquiries, and 3 police investigations. when they announced the HIA inquiry, the Historical Institutional Abuse Inquiry, which was known as HIA, under retired Judge Sir Anthony Hart, they said that it could not be part of the inquiry in England into child sex abuse. And the reason for that was, if they kept it in Northern Ireland, MI5 couldn't be held to public account. Once again, MI5 escaped. They were in London and therefore could only give Judge Hart voluntary evidence. They could have put someone up to provide testimony, and they could provide documents. But they basically chose what they told them. And one of the strange things about all of that is, in one of the documents that they gave Hart, they had a minute of a very senior meeting of MI5 in London to decide how they would deal with George Caskey's third investigation, which was into two people who were familiar with the Secret Services, and that was Colin Willis and Fred Holroyd. And one of the 3 or 4 MI5 officers said, well, why don't we give Caskey false files? Well, why not indeed? Have you done this before? If so, when? Well, those were the kind of questions journalists would have wanted to ask. Hart didn't bother. Hart found some way, some form of words to say that this wasn't to be taken seriously.
In the course of working on this story, you observed other people losing their jobs, people ending up in prison, or one person ending up in prison. How much were you at risk?
I never know for sure, but in 1990, when a good friend of mine who was in employment by the government, was threatened by MI5 to be mindful if he wanted to keep his job and his pension, to break off all contacts with me. And that was a warning to me as well. And I took off for 2 years to England. I don't know if I would have become a target. I don't know if I am a target. I do happen to know that they were at one stage listening to my telephone. I'm pursuing that at the moment to see where that leads. But I could understand the need for a Secret Service, and they do things that we aren't entitled to know about. But what I can't understand is this Secret Service being used to cover up the rape and abuse of young boys, in the same way as another story I did about a priest, Father Brendan Smith, who was protected for 40 years by the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. Why do these people want to protect the so-called good name of their organisations by covering up for criminals? In my view, the people who knew and did nothing should be up before the courts, because what they're doing is a criminal offence. They are aiding and abetting rapists.
As a society, how much have we learnt from the Kincora story?
There's no evidence that we are going to take it seriously. Children are left to carry the burden of guilt. They are left with horrific memories that drive them to drink, drugs. They don't have the ability to sustain long-term relationships. And many of them commit suicide. And sometimes those suicides go unnoticed because the child that was raped or abused hasn't actually told anyone what had happened to them. So no, society needs to up its game to deal with these people. They are real, they are forever, and they don't change their spots.
Chris, I don't know where to start. Thanking you for your massive perseverance, your dedication, your courage, and your commitment to your craft as an investigative journalist and author, and more than that, how to thank you for writing this amazing book, which asks so many questions about the society we live in today, and will probably, unfortunately, live in tomorrow. The book Kincora's Shame by Chris Moore is now on sale. We haven't covered the half of it. Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.